Welcome to episode 59 of Gods and Heroes of Ancient Greece. My name is MyLinda Butterworth, and today we will continue with the tale of the Heraclidae, with the story of Hyllus and his descendants. The sons of Heracles vowed eternal gratitude to Demophoon, and left Athens under the guidance of Hyllus, their brother, and Aeolus, their friend. Now they found allies in all quarters and journeyed to the Peloponnesus, the land which had been their fathers'. For a whole year they fought from town to town until all had surrendered, save Argos. During this time a terrible plague raged throughout the peninsula and would not abate. At last an oracle revealed to the Heraclidae that they themselves were the cause of this affliction, since they had returned before the appointed time. So they left the Peloponnesus, which they had already occupied with their forces, and journeyed back to Attica. Here they settled on the plain of Marathon. Hyllus, meantime, had fulfilled his father's wishes by marrying lovely Iole, whom Heracles himself had once wooed, and pondered without ceasing how he might gain possession of his heritage. Finally, he again consulted the oracle of Delphi and received this reply: "When the third harvest had been reaped, you will succeed in returning." Hyllus took this to mean quite simply that he was to await the third year of gathering the fruits of the field. So when the third summer had passed, he once more invaded Peloponnesus. After the death of Eurystheus, Artius, grandson of Tantalus, the son of Pelops, had become the king of Mycenae. When he learned of the approach of Hyllus, he joined forces with the city of Tegea and other neighboring towns and went forth to meet the sons of Heracles on the Isthmus of Corinth. The armies came to face, but Hyllus, who was always intent on saving the land of Greece from the ravages of war, again offered to decide the issue by single combat. He challenged anyone in the host of the enemy who was minded to fight with him, and certain that he had fulfilled the oracle and thus gained the approval of the gods for his undertaking, set the condition that should he win, the realm Eurystheus had governed should go to the sons of Heracles, and that if he were defeated, the descendants of Heracles should not set foot on the Peloponnesus for 50 years to come. When his words became known in the enemy camp, Eximus, king of Tegea, a warrior in the very prime of life, accepted the challenge. Both combatants fought with boldness and skill, but Hyllus was defeated. Even in his death, his forehead was furrowed and his mouth bitter with brooding on the ambiguous oracle which had led him into battle. The Heraclidae kept to their agreement, desisted from further fighting, returned to Attica, and never again settled near Marathon. The years passed, and the sons of Heracles never thought of breaking their word. They made no attempt to win back their heritage. In the meantime, Cleodas, son of Hyllus, had passed his 50th year. Since the period for the truth had elapsed and his hands were no longer tied by the promise, he and the other grandsons of Heracles attacked the Peloponnesus at a time when the Trojan War was already 30 years past. But he, too, was luckless as his father before him. He perished in this campaign, and all his men with him. 20 years later, his son, Astromachus, grandson of Hyllus and great-grandson of Heracles, made another attempt. This was the time when Tisamenus, a son of Orestes, ruled the Peloponnesus. Aristomachus, too, was led astray by the enigmatic words of an oracle. The gods will grant you victory by narrow passage. He invaded the Peloponnesus by way of the Isthmus, was beaten back, and lost his life like his father and his grandfather before him. 30 years passed, and for 80 years Troy had lain in ashes. The sons of Astromachus, Tamenos, Cresphontes, and Aristomenes, the grandsons of Cleodas, fared forth on their line's ancestral quest. Despite the seeming trickery of the oracles, they staunchly held to their faith in the gods, went to the Delphi and asked the priestess concerning the outcome of their enterprise. But the two answers she gave were word for word the same their forebears had received. When the third harvest has been reaped, you will succeed in returning, and the gods will grant you victory by the narrow passage. Then Temenos, eldest of the three brothers, said mournfully, My father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather obeyed these utterances, and all met with destruction. And at last the god took pity on these three, and through the priestess disclosed to them the oracle's true meaning. Your forebears themselves were to blame for their misfortune, she said. They could not interpret the wise words of the gods. What the immortals meant was not the third harvest of the fruits of the earth, but the third harvest from the seed of your race. The first was Cleodas, the second Astromachus, and the third harvest, that to which victory is promised, is that of you three brothers. As for the narrow passage, there again those luckless ones now dead misunderstood what was implied. The gods were not speaking of the isthmus, but of a different passage, of the Straits of Corinth. Now that you know the meaning of the oracle, do what you have to set out to do and embark upon your enterprise with the good fortunes attending gods. When Temenos heard this explanation, it was as though scales had dropped from his eyes. Together with his brothers, he rapidly equipped the great host and had ships built in Locris, a place which, to commemorate this, was later called Naupactos, which means shipyard. But even this expedition, launched under such happy auspices, was beset with difficulties for the descendants of Heracles, and cost them grave concern and many tears. When the host was assembled, Astrodimus, the youngest of the brothers, was struck by lightning. His wife, Argia, the great-granddaughter of Polynices, thus became a widow, and his twin sons, Eurysthenes and Procles, were left fatherless. When Astrodimus had been buried and the squadron of ships was to leave Locris, a soothsayer appeared, one who was inspired by the gods and issued oracles. But the descendants of Heracles took him for a sorcerer or a spy sent by the Peloponnesians to destroy their host. They persecuted him with suspicions and harshness, and finally Hippotas, son of Hyllus and great-grandson of Heracles, hurled his lance at the old man, who was killed on the instant. This roused the anger of the gods against the Heraclidae. A tempest shattered their ships and sank them to the bottom of the sea. Their land troops suffered long famine, and soon the entire host dissolved. Concerning this disaster also, Temenos sought the advice of the oracle. Because of the seer you have killed, so ran the answer, all this has overtaken you. For 10 years you shall banish the murderer from the land, and put the three-eyed in command of the host. The first part of the oracle was quickly carried out. Hippotas was removed from the army and compelled to go into exile. But the second drove the Heraclidae to the verge of despair. For how and where were they to find anyone with 3 eyes? Yet they looked for such a man entirely, so great was their trust in the gods. At last they happened to find Oxylus, of the line of the kings of Aetola, son of Haman, and descendant of Oeneus. At the very time the Heraclidae invaded the Peloponnesus, Oxylus had committed murder and had been forced to flee from his native Aetola to the little land of Elis in the Peloponnesus. Now that a year had gone by, he was on his way back to his country, and met the descendants of Heracles as he was riding his donkey. The Oxylus had only 1 eye, for as a child he had put out the other with an arrow. So his donkey had to help him see, and the man and beast together had 3 eyes. The Heraclidae realized that the singular oracle had been fulfilled, and chose Oxylus for their leader. In this way the conditions set by the fate were satisfied. They attacked their enemies with fresh troops and a new squadron of ships, and slew Tisamenus, the leader of the Peloponnesian host. And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends, enjoy the journey.